The winter wind off the Chesapeake bit through the coats of the officers standing behind the sandbag line. They stamped their boots and tucked their chins into their collars as they watched the thing on the range, a dull steel cylinder aimed at a sheet of armor plate mounted 50 yards away. The target was standard German specification, 1½ inches of rolled homogeneous armor, the kind protecting the front of a Panzer III in North Africa. No one expected much. The army had been trying for years to give the common infantryman a way to stop a tank. Every effort had failed. The rifles bounced, the grenades shattered, and the small cannon were so heavy that 2 men could barely drag them through mud. Armor always advanced faster than the weapons meant to kill it. At the firing line stood Lieutenant Edward Uhl, age 23, United States Army Ordnance Department. He had the flat vowels of an Ohio farm boy and the expression of a man who trusted his own hands more than any manual. The weapon in his hands did not look like anything that belonged on a battlefield. It looked like plumbing an open steel tube, 5 feet long, wired with an electric trigger, powered by flashlight batteries taped to the side. Beside him stood Dr. Clarence Hickman, a civilian ordnance engineer in his 50s, small, bespectacled, a mathematician who had once built experimental rockets for Bell Laboratories. Hickman had the patient tone of a scientist who had seen too many promising ideas die in smoke. Together, the 2 men made an unlikely pair, a scientist who thought in equations and a farm kid who thought in tools. But both knew they were staring at an unsolved emergency. Germany's tanks ruled Europe. The Panzer divisions had crushed France in 6 weeks, and in the deserts of Libya the same grey machines were pushing British forces backward toward Egypt. Their armor grew thicker every month. In comparison, the United States infantryman of early 1942 was almost naked. The standard anti-tank rifle grenade could not penetrate a single inch of steel. The old 37mm gun, once thought deadly, could not pierce the side armor of a late-model Panzer. The heavier 75mm guns existed only in small numbers. America had entered the war with bravery, but not with the tools to back it. Uhl had seen the reports from North Africa, German tanks shrugging off hits, American shells glancing away, and infantrymen with nothing to do but dig deeper holes. Something had to change, fast. The new device on the firing line was supposed to be that change. Its heart was a shaped charge warhead, a metal cone lined with explosives that focused its energy into a jet capable of melting through steel. The principle, known as the Monroe effect, had been understood since the 1880s but rarely mastered. The Ordnance Department had a warhead that worked in the laboratory. What they did not have was a way to throw it far enough, fast enough, and accurately enough for a soldier to use without dying in the process. Hickman had spent months experimenting with rocket propulsion, small steel tubes filled with solid propellant that could hurl a projectile without recoil. His tests had produced beautiful mathematics and shattered equipment, but no weapon fit for the field. Uhl, new to the team, saw the problem differently. He looked at the rocket and the warhead and the mountain of spare tubing lying outside the workshop and thought of a piece of pipe on his father's farm, something to guide the rocket instead of fight its kick. Now, standing in the cold Maryland air, he was about to see whether his backyard idea would work. Hickman called out the countdown. 3, 2, 1. Uhl pressed the doorbell switch. There was a brief hiss, a flash of orange, and a line of smoke as the rocket leapt from the tube. It struck the armor plate with a sharp metallic crack. For an instant nothing happened. Then a narrow, perfect hole appeared in the center of the plate. The steel around the entry point glowed red. On the back side, a jagged cone of molten metal burst outward like the petal of a flower. The officers behind the sandbags stared. Someone whistled low. One of them muttered, "Good God, it went through." Hickman smiled for the first time that day. "It works," he said quietly. Uhl lowered the tube, smoke curling from the muzzle. "It's ugly," he said, "but it works." The test team measured the hole. The jet had cut through more than 3 inches of armor, more than enough to destroy any German tank then in service. The young lieutenant's homemade launcher had done what entire design committees had failed to do. That night, in the ordnance barracks, the men talked about what they had seen. One engineer compared it to a thunderbolt. Another said it looked like something a plumber's apprentice might build in a barn. Uhl just shrugged. He had built it from what he could find: discarded aircraft tubing, surplus rocket motors, and electrical parts scavenged from the workshop. He had even soldered the firing circuit himself. On the farm, he explained, when something broke, you fixed it with what you had. Waiting for new parts meant watching the harvest rot. In Washington, the Army Ordnance Department sent cables to every testing ground in the country. They wanted immediate replication and field trials, but paperwork moved slower than war. Weeks passed while reports were typed, stamped, and filed. In Europe, the German army rolled east toward Stalingrad. In North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Korps prepared another counterattack, and in the Pacific, Japanese tanks pressed through the jungles of the Philippines. For the men at Aberdeen, time became the enemy. Hickman worked by day refining the propellant mixture, and Uhl by night building launch tubes by hand. Each morning they carried the crude weapons to the range, and each evening they filed damage, reports that read like miracles. At 100 yards the rocket flew straight. At 200 it still struck with enough force to burn through armor plate. By early spring the weapon had earned a code name, the Monet rocket launcher. The soldiers who saw it called it something else. During a demonstration, a visiting general's aide watched the rocket streak down range and said the sound reminded him of a carnival band instrument, Bob Burns's famous bazooka. The nickname stuck. The bazooka was born not from laboratories or factories, but from one lieutenant's instinct that a pipe and a rocket could give a man on foot the power to fight a tank. It was a weapon built by necessity, faith, and a little farm boy stubbornness. Yet even after that first success, the victory was only partial. The launcher was fragile, the battery unreliable in the cold, and the rocket sometimes veered off like a drunk bird. But the essential truth was proven. A single man could now carry a weapon capable of defeating armor that had ruled the battlefield for years. As the winter of 1942 dragged into spring, shipments of steel tubing began arriving from Pennsylvania mills. The Ordnance Department ordered immediate production trials. Hickman's lab became a factory overnight, filling with the smell of propellant and the echo of hammering. Uhl wrote to his parents in Ohio that he had built something that might just even the odds. No one at Aberdeen could know then that the crude pipe they tested in the snow would one day be carried through the ruins of Normandy and across the bridges of the Rhine, that its rockets would burn through the sides of German Tigers and Panthers, the pride of Hitler's army, or that the world's tank designers would spend the next decade trying to invent armor that could resist what a farm kid had created with scrap metal and a handful of dry-cell batteries. For now, on that grey January afternoon, they only knew one thing for certain. When the shaped charge warhead punched through that plate, history changed course. The age of the tank's invincibility was ending, and the end had begun in a Maryland field with a piece of pipe and a lieutenant who refused to wait for permission to solve a problem. By the early months of 1942, the problem facing the United States Army was brutally simple. The German tank was evolving faster than the weapons meant to stop it. What had begun as thinly armored vehicles in 1939 had become rolling fortresses by 1942. The Panzer III and Panzer IV, now equipped with thicker frontal plates and long 75mm guns, could shrug off nearly every American or British anti-tank weapon that infantry could carry. The Army's standard 37mm gun, once advertised as the tank killer, had become a joke on the battlefields of North Africa. Reports from Tunisia told the same story over and over: shells bouncing, armor intact, German crews laughing inside their panzers. A sergeant of the 1st Armored Division wrote in his after-action report, "You might as well throw rocks. The heavier 75mm pieces could do the job, but those were divisional weapons, heavy, slow to move, and few in number. Infantry caught without them were helpless. The science of armor had outpaced the means of killing it. German engineers, masters of metallurgy, had learned how to slope plates so that every hit glanced off, and to weld them into hulls that no rifleman could touch. Against that, the United States could offer courage and little else. In the laboratories at Aberdeen, the Ordnance Department had already begun exploring exotic possibilities: magnetic mines, rifle grenades, and satchel charges. All of them worked in theory, none of them were practical. The infantryman needed a weapon he could carry and fire alone, a weapon with reach, accuracy, and the punch to pierce steel, measured in inches, not fractions. That weapon did not yet exist. Dr. Clarence Hickman, a civilian physicist turned ordnance specialist, had been studying the shaped charge, a curious phenomenon first demonstrated by Swiss scientists in the 1930s. When a hollow metal cone lined with explosives detonated, the energy did not radiate outward evenly. It focused into a jet of molten metal that cut through steel as if it were butter. The principle became known as the Monroe effect, named for an American chemist who had first noticed it in the 19th century while experimenting with explosives on copper plates. But the military had never turned it into a working weapon. Hickman had the warhead. The problem was delivery. Firing a shaped charge from a gun destroyed its delicate cone. Throwing it by hand risked killing the man who threw it. What was needed was something new, a propulsion system powerful enough to carry the warhead, yet gentle enough not to ruin it. The answer lay in rocketry, a field so young that most generals dismissed it as science fiction. Before the war, Hickman had been part of a small group at Bell Laboratories experimenting with miniature rockets for research purposes. Those early models had been unstable and wildly inaccurate, but they had one miraculous property: no recoil. The rocket pushed itself forward instead of kicking backward against the firer. That single fact would change everything. When the Ordnance Department assigned young Lieutenant Edward Uhl to Hickman's team in late 1941, it was less a promotion than an act of desperation. Uhl was not a theorist, he was a builder. His record showed aptitude with machinery and an impatience with bureaucracy traits that rarely led to glory but often led to progress. Hickman saw in him the one quality a laboratory full of scientists lacked: the willingness to improvise. The two men worked out of a drafty shop on the edge of Aberdeen Proving Ground, a place littered with spare tubing, broken shells, and abandoned ideas. Hickman focused on stabilizing the rocket. Uhl studied how to guide it. Their early experiments were disasters: rockets that spiraled out of control, warheads that detonated prematurely, launchers that burned through their own frames. But failure only sharpened their resolve. By December, the Army's European observers were sending back grim intelligence. German armour on the Eastern Front had reached unheard-of thicknesses. Rumours described a new tank under development, the Panzer, with armour that would make every Allied anti-tank gun obsolete. The idea that infantry could stand up to such machines seemed hopeless. At night, Uhl lay awake thinking of that hopelessness. He imagined himself in the shoes of the ordinary rifleman, watching tanks roll through a position, powerless to stop them. That thought became a kind of fury. There has to be a way, he told Hickman. There always is. So he searched the scrap piles outside the workshop, scavenging tubing from discarded aircraft assemblies. He found a section just wide enough to cradle Hickman's 2 3/10-inch rocket. He wired a crude electrical firing circuit using flashlight batteries and a doorbell switch scavenged from the barracks. It was not pretty, but it could hold the rocket steady and let a soldier fire without losing an arm. When they tested the device, it belched smoke and noise but sent the rocket straight down range. It worked because it was simple. The Army's engineers had been designing weapons for factories. Uhl designed one for fields and foxholes. In that simplicity lay genius. The pipe was light enough for one man to carry, long enough to stabilize flight, and cheap enough to mass produce. It could be made anywhere in America where steel tubing could be cut and welded. In Uhl's words, "If you can build a stovepipe, you can build this." Hickman ran the numbers afterward, scribbling equations to understand what the young lieutenant had done. the physics checked out. The rocket, guided by the tube, had the velocity to carry the shaped charge 200 yards and still penetrate armor thicker than anything in the Wehrmacht's inventory. The problem no one could solve, how to give an infantryman the power to kill a tank, had been solved not by a laboratory, but by a man who grew up fixing tractors with wire and pliers. When Uhl presented his idea to the Ordnance Board, the senior colonel in charge asked dryly, "Lieutenant, do you really expect soldiers to fire a pipe full of fire from their shoulder?" Uhl's answer was quiet but certain. "Yes, sir, and it'll work." A month later, when the weapon tore a clean hole through German armor plate at the Aberdeen range, that colonel ordered immediate field trials. He would later admit privately that he had never seen such a simple device accomplish so much. In the archives of the Ordnance Department, the official report for that month closed with one understated sentence: "The rocket launcher, improvised design, demonstrates potential for effective infantry anti-tank application." Behind those words hid the truth. A farm kid's homemade fix had just begun to change the mathematics of modern warfare. Spring of 1942 brought mud, sleepless nights, and the constant vibration of artillery tests echoing across Aberdeen Proving Ground. The war still felt far away in miles, but every headline reminded the men in the Ordnance Department that distance meant nothing anymore. Germany was advancing again in Russia, and Rommel's Afrika Korps was moving toward Alexandria. The United States needed answers faster than committees could draft memos. Lieutenant Edward Uhl spent those nights in a small tin-roofed shed that smelled of oil and ozone. His improvised launcher, the 5-foot steel pipe with a doorbell switch, sat on a bench next to piles of burnt rockets. It was ugly, but it had done. Something no other weapon in the army had done. It had made a hole in tank armor. Uhl called it a farm fix, a piece of equipment born the same way every repair on his father's farm had been born, out of necessity, not theory. Dr. Clarence Hickman, older and precise, hovered nearby with his notebook. He measured everything: velocity, recoil, the shape of the exhaust plume. He trusted mathematics. Uhl trusted experience. Together, the two men formed an uneasy alliance between intuition and science. Hickman had the warhead, the heart of the weapon. Uhl had given it lungs and a voice. The next step was to make it practical. The early launch tube was heavy, and its crude firing mechanism tended to misfire. Hickman proposed using an electrical trigger powered by a dry cell battery. Uhl built one from scavenged flashlight parts and insulated the wires with tape from the base telephone depot. It looked ridiculous, like a child's science project, but the simplicity made it reliable. When they demonstrated the weapon again that March, the results were undeniable. The shaped charge warhead punched through an armor plate at 200 yards, leaving a hole clean enough to slide a hand through. The backblast created a sheet of flame that scorched the snow behind the launcher, but the firer stood unharmed. The officers who witnessed the test stopped laughing. The weapon's official name became the Moan rocket launcher. The men who saw it preferred the nickname borrowed from a radio comedian's homemade trombone, the bazooka. Within weeks, the prototype was on its way to production at the General Electric plant in Schenectady, New York. The order called for 5,000 launchers and 25,000 rockets. But before mass production could begin, the weapon needed proof in combat. Paper victories did not stop tanks. Uhl and Hickman sent the first working examples to field units for testing: one crate to Fort Benning, another to Camp Blanding, and a small shipment to the newly formed Tank Destroyer Command in Texas. Reports came back filled with surprise. A corporal from the test platoon wrote, "You can hit a moving target at 100 yards, and it burns right through. Makes a man feel like he's got a say against a tank for once." That sense of power was new. For years, infantry had been trained to fear armor, to hide, to wait for the artillery, to dig holes and hope. Now a man with a single tube and a pair of rockets could face steel and win. The army bureaucracy, usually slow, moved with astonishing speed. Production orders multiplied. The Army Signal Corps standardized the electrical firing circuit. Factories across the Midwest began turning out launcher tubes by the thousands. Women who had never handled a weapon in their lives welded, wired, and tested them. One plant supervisor remarked that the device was as simple as a stovepipe and about as easy to make. By summer, the first operational batches were ready for shipment. The destination was North Africa, where American forces under General Eisenhower were preparing for renewed fighting against Rommel's tanks. A few officers objected to sending unproven weapons into battle, but the reply from Ordnance Command was blunt. If it kills tanks, send it. Uhl watched the first wooden crates loaded onto rail cars. Each held 10 launchers wrapped in grease paper, 100 rockets, and an instruction sheet no longer than a page. He could hardly believe that something built from scrap tubing and wire was now bound for war. Hickman shook his head. "Do you realize?" he said quietly. "We just handed a foot soldier the power of an artillery gun." Uhl smiled. "That's the idea." Across the Atlantic, German engineers continued to refine their armor, adding layers of steel and reinforcing welds, unaware that an American farm boy's invention would soon make those calculations obsolete. In August of 1942, the first field, evaluations came back from Tunisia. The message, brief and unpolished, carried more weight than any official endorsement. Weapon, effective, penetration complete. Recommend immediate issue to all combat units. It was the proof everyone had been waiting for. The bazooka was no longer an experiment, it was a weapon of war. For Uhl, the news arrived in a single telegram. He read it twice, folded it neatly, and slid it into his pocket. Then he went back to his workbench. There were still improvements to make better sights, stronger wiring, lighter materials, but for the first time he allowed himself a moment of quiet pride. Outside the workshop, the spring wind carried the distant sound of artillery tests and the smell of cordite. Hickman approached, notebook in hand. "You've changed the balance of the battlefield," he said. Uhl looked down at the scorched launcher on his bench. "Maybe," he answered, "but I just wanted to give our boys a fighting chance." Neither man could know that in less than a year, soldiers on the other side of the world would use that same invention to turn the tide of armored warfare, and that the sight of a single man kneeling with a tube on his shoulder would one day make German tank commanders flinch. The farm fix had worked. The pipe, the batteries, and the stubbornness of one young lieutenant had rewritten the rules of modern war. In November of 1942, the first crates of the new rocket launcher arrived on the docks of Oran, Algeria. They were stamped Moni Rocket Launcher, AT, but the soldiers unloading them called them by the name already spreading through the ranks, the bazooka. Most had never seen one before. Some thought it looked like a plumber's mistake, others like a stovepipe with delusions of grandeur. But when the first demonstration took place outside the port city, doubt turned into fascination. The instructor placed a single launcher on its bipod, loaded a rocket, and shouted, "Watch close." The flash, the hiss, and the roar that followed were unforgettable. The projectile struck the side of an obsolete French tank used for training. The shaped charge exploded in a bright flower of fire, and a thin plume of black smoke rose from a hole that went clear through the armor. The watching infantrymen burst into cheers. "Looks like that farm kid back home built us something real," a corporal muttered, spitting dust from his mouth. Within days, platoons of American infantry were drilling with the new weapon under the North African sun. The instructions were brutally simple. Load, aim, fire, reload. The bazooka required teamwork, one man to carry the launcher, another to handle the rockets. Each rocket had to be loaded carefully, its wires connected to the battery circuit, its fin straightened by hand. There were no safeties, no guarantees. The weapon could kill as easily as it could save, but the men didn't care. For the first time, they could look at a tank and feel power instead of fear. When the weapon first went into combat during the fighting near Kasserine Pass in early 1943, its reputation was made. German Panzer IIIs and Italian Semoventes rolled toward thin American lines, expecting another easy breakthrough. Instead, they met a rain of armor-piercing rockets. Infantrymen who had once hidden from tanks now hunted them. Sergeant William Orlando of the 1st Infantry Division later recalled, "We saw the rockets burn through the sides like butter. You hit it once, and the whole thing lit up. We called it our pocket artillery." Word spread quickly through the German ranks. Prisoners captured in the aftermath spoke of a new American tank gun that one man can carry. The German High Command dismissed it as exaggeration until their own troops began requesting countermeasures. By mid-1943, intelligence officers in Berlin had photographs of the weapon recovered from battlefields in Tunisia. They were astonished. It was nothing like their heavy Panzer designs or complex recoilless rifles. It was crude, yet it worked. Within months, the German army began developing a copy, the Raketenpanzerbuchs, or Panzer, modelled directly after Uhl's invention. In a grim twist of history, a weapon built by an American farm boy would soon be turned against Allied tanks by the Wehrmacht. Back in the United States, Lieutenant Uhl read the first field reports with disbelief. The weapon he had built from scrap was now shaping the outcome of battles thousands of miles away. Dr. Hickman, always the scientist, marked the details in his notebook: penetration depths, ranges, failures. The data confirmed what they had both hoped. The shaped charge warhead, when properly delivered, could defeat armor far thicker than anyone had imagined. Still, perfection was distant. Early versions of the bazooka suffered from misfires in rain, electrical shorts, and flimsy sights that bent under rough handling. In North Africa, sand fouled the batteries and dust jammed the rockets. Yet even with all its faults, the weapon gave soldiers what no engineer had promised before hope. A report from the 1st Armoured Division summed it up. The rocket launcher inspires confidence. Troops regard it as their best protection against tanks. That simple sentence found its way onto the desk of General Eisenhower, who underlined it and wrote in the margin, "Produce more immediately." Production surged. By the summer of 1943, American factories were turning out thousands of launchers and hundreds of thousands of rockets every month. The design was refined into a lighter, collapsible model, the M9, with improved wiring and a stronger battery. The ordnance officers joked that Uhl's farm fix had turned into an industrial revolution. But to the soldiers using it, the bazooka was more than a tool. It was a symbol that the days of running from tanks were over. In Sicily, they used it to ambush German armoured cars. In Italy, paratroopers carried it up mountains where no gun could follow. In the Pacific, Marines used it to blast open Japanese bunkers thick with concrete and coral. And yet, despite its success, the man who had built it never saw combat. Lieutenant Edward Uhl remained at Aberdeen, refining his creation for men he would never meet. Hickman once told him, "You've given every soldier the strength of an artillery piece." Uhl only shook his head. "No," he said, "I just gave them a fighting chance." By the end of 1943, the bazooka had become an icon of the modern battlefield, a weapon so simple that even the enemy copied it, so effective that generals rewrote tactics around it, and so improbable that its inventor still thought of it as a patch, not a masterpiece. And yet, that patch had changed everything. One man, one pipe, and one spark of defiance had done what entire arsenals had failed to do. He had stopped Hitler's tanks in their tracks. By the dawn of 1944, the bazooka was no longer a curiosity. It was a doctrine. Manuals were rewritten to include it. Training films were shot in California deserts and Louisiana swamps, and every new infantry division bound for Europe or the Pacific carried the weapon that had begun as a farm boy's experiment. The United States Army had finally armed the common soldier with the means to fight back against the armored terror that had ruled the battlefields of Europe since 1939. Lieutenant Edward Uhl watched from Aberdeen as production numbers grew faster than he could have imagined. Factories in Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and Ohio were producing launchers by the tens of thousands, while women on assembly lines inserted the delicate copper-lined cones into the rocket heads with the precision of jewelers. Each one bore the small stamp at Rocket M6. The military called them ordnance to Uhl. They were insurance policies, guarantees that a soldier in a foxhole had a chance. In England, as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe, crates of bazookas arrived by the shipload. The men of the 1st Infantry Division, the same who had bloodied their weapon in Tunisia, were issued the new M9 model, with a collapsible tube for easier carrying and an improved sight. One corporal described the first time he fired it during training near Salisbury Plain. "It kicks like a whisper, and it bites like thunder." The European campaign, however, would prove a harsher test than any desert or firing range. German armour had grown deadlier. The Panzer IV now bore skirts of steel to deflect shaped charges. Worse still, the new Tiger and Panther tanks had arrived machines so massive that their very presence changed battles. Their armour, up to 100 millimeters thick in places, seemed invincible. To many soldiers, it was as if the enemy had built monsters of iron. Yet even monsters have weak spots. Allied intelligence circulated diagrams showing where the bazooka could bite flanks, engine decks, the thin armour beneath turrets. The rocket, properly aimed, could still burn through those vulnerabilities. It became a weapon of ambush, of courage measured in distance. Infantrymen would let the tanks roll past within 50 yards before firing, praying the backblast did not reveal their positions. On June 6, 1944 D-Day, the weapon earned its place in legend. In the chaos of Omaha Beach, Sergeant Frank Peregrine of the 29th Infantry used a bazooka to knock out a German machine gun nest firing from a concrete bunker. The blast tore through the wall, silencing the gun and opening a gap for advancing troops. Dozens of similar stories emerged that day, infantrymen using the weapon not just against tanks, but against pillboxes, walls, and anything else standing in their way. The German High Command, analysing reports from Normandy, took grim notice. General Heinz Guderian wrote in his diary, "The enemy's infantry possesses a weapon of terrible simplicity. No tank may approach without fear. Even so, the battlefield was no place for romance. The bazooka was never perfect. The rockets were fragile, their fuses sensitive to moisture, and in cold weather the electrical batteries sometimes failed entirely. Soldiers learned to keep them under their armpits for warmth, or improvise wiring from field radios when parts broke. It was a soldier's weapon, built to be abused and repaired with whatever was at hand, just as Uhl had built it." Back home, Uhl read the combat reports and felt a strange mix of pride and guilt. The weapon worked too well, perhaps. He had seen photographs of burned-out Panzers, their armour pierced and crews still inside. He understood the physics. He had calculated the pressure and the jet temperature. But knowing that his creation had turned those numbers into death weighed on him. "I built a fix," he wrote to his parents, "but it fixes things by breaking others." Still, the necessity of war left no room for hesitation. The German Panzerschreck, an enlarged copy of the bazooka, firing a heavier rocket, had begun to appear on the Western Front. It was deadly, but also cumbersome, requiring protective masks to shield users from backblast. In contrast, the American launcher remained light and fast. It could be carried by one man and fired in seconds. In the hedgerows of Normandy and the forests of Belgium, the bazooka became the infantryman's answer to steel. When the Battle of the Bulge erupted in December 1944, soldiers crouched behind snowbanks waiting for German tanks to emerge from the mist. The Tiger tanks came on with engines growling, their armour glistening with frost. In the shattered villages of Bastogne and Streetvith, bazooka teams hid in doorways, aiming at the beast's flanks. A well-placed shot could stop a tank dead, flames licking from its hatches. Private Carl Peterson of the 101st Airborne wrote in his diary, "We hit one Tiger in the tracks, then two in the side. They burned all night. For once, the bazooka felt like David's sling." The weapon's presence reshaped battle itself. Where once tanks could roll unchecked, they now hesitated, wary of every ditch and hedgerow. Infantry units, armed with what had started as a scrap metal experiment, had restored balance to the battlefield. By war's end, more than 500,000 bazookas had been produced. They appeared in every theatre from the ruins of Manila to the snows of the Ardennes. The Germans copied it, the Soviets studied it, and after 1945, every major army on Earth built a version of it. But none of that could have been foreseen in those cold Maryland fields 2 years earlier. Uhl had not set out to change the world's armies. He had set out to give an ordinary man a chance. And now, as Allied columns pushed east toward the Rhine, it was clear that chance had become power. The weapon built from a farmer's imagination had crossed oceans, survived deserts, and turned the tide of industrial war. In its simple hiss and smoke lay the answer to a question that had haunted every soldier since the first tank rolled across a battlefield. What can one man do against steel? By 1944, the answer was clear: one man could fight back and win. Spring of 1945. Europe was breaking apart under its own smoke. Allied armies were crossing the Rhine, cities lay in ruins, and the once invincible German armour was dying faster than it could move. On every front, the bazooka born in a Maryland workshop of scavenged pipe and battery wire had become the ordinary soldier's reaper of steel. In the ruined villages of western Germany, the air was thick with the smell of burnt oil and cordite. The thunder of tank engines no longer inspired dread among infantrymen. Instead, they waited calmly, crouched behind stone walls, their launchers resting on their shoulders like shepherds' staffs. They knew the drill: wait for the flank, aim for the vents, squeeze the trigger, and let the shaped charge do the rest. The Germans, who had once rolled forward with the arrogance of invulnerability, now advanced in fear. Their tank crews called the bazooka Donnerfaust, Thunder Fist. They dreaded the sight of the long tube or the shimmer of a rocket's exhaust. After every engagement, Allied troops would find Panthers and Tigers abandoned in the open, their hatches ajar, engines still running. The crews had bailed before the rockets arrived. From the hedgerows of France to the cobblestones of Cologne, the weapon that Edward Uhl had built had transformed warfare. It had rewritten the hierarchy of the battlefield. Once, armour had ruled infantry. Now, infantry ruled armour. The transformation was so complete that it reshaped German strategy itself. A captured Wehrmacht report from February 1945 admitted, infantry anti-tank weapons, particularly the American rocket launcher, have neutralized the psychological advantage of armour. It was a bureaucratic way of saying that the bazooka had undone years of German dominance. Lieutenant Uhl followed these reports from Aberdeen with an engineer's fascination and a soldier's humility. He had long since stopped counting production numbers: 500,000 launchers, nearly 15 million rockets, but every statistic was a ghost in its own way. Each number meant another fight, another crew burned alive inside a tank. The weapon that had given soldiers hope had also given them power beyond measure. In March of 1945, an army photographer sent him a photograph from the front lines near Remagen. It showed 2 mud-caked infantrymen standing beside a destroyed Panther tank. One of them leaned casually on a bazooka. On the back, someone had scrawled, "This one's for you, Lieutenant." Uhl kept the photo in his desk drawer for the rest of his life. Across the Pacific, the bazooka was waging a different kind of war. On Luzon, Okinawa, and Iwo Jima, the weapon that had been designed to pierce steel was used to shatter concrete and coral. Japanese bunkers, invisible to artillery, were blasted open at point-blank range by Marines carrying the same stovepipe launcher. Lieutenant Charles McCool of the 5th Marine Division wrote home, "We use it like a door knocker. One shot and the whole cave collapses." Japanese soldiers learned to fear the weapon as much as German tankers had. Captured diaries spoke of the fire tube that could kill without warning. At Iwo Jima, Marines reported hearing enemy soldiers shout "bazooka" before diving into cover. But the Pacific also revealed the limits of the design. The dense jungles and narrow island caves often made it impossible to fire without backblast, injuring the operator. Many Marines learned to dig shallow pits behind them or fire from standing positions, accepting the burns as part of the job. The weapon's simplicity was both its strength and its curse. It worked anywhere, but it punished carelessness. As the war drew to a close, the bazooka became a symbol of the American way of war: improvised, mass-produced, brutally effective. It was the weapon of the citizen soldier, as homespun as it was deadly. When General Eisenhower addressed the Ordnance Department in April 1945, he mentioned it by name. "The rocket launcher has given the infantryman back his dignity," he said. "No longer does he stand helpless before the machine." At Aberdeen, Uhl listened to the broadcast on a crackling radio. Around him, the next generation of weapons was already being tested: heavier rockets, improved propellants, experimental guidance systems. But none of them carried the same feeling as that first rough pipe he had wired together 3 years earlier. Dr. Clarence Hickman, now grey and tired, visited him one afternoon and watched the tests in silence. "Finally," he said, "do you realize, Ed, that we've started something that won't stop? From now on, every war will have its rocket." Uhl didn't answer at first. The horizon shook with the sound of another launch, another weapon arcing skyward. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but let's hope they remember why we built the first one." By May of 1945, Hitler was dead, and the war in Europe was over. In the Pacific, the final battles raged toward their terrible conclusion. The bazooka had done its work. Tanks, once symbols of unstoppable might, now lay rusting across 2 continents. In its simplicity lay its genius: a steel tube, a shaped charge, and a spark of American stubbornness. It had begun in a farm kid's imagination and ended as a revolution in warfare. When peace finally came, men who had carried the weapon home kept it in their memories like a badge of survival. To them, it was more than a machine. It was proof that courage and ingenuity could stand against the weight of an empire and win. The iron harvest was over. The plowshares would return to the fields, but the lesson of the bazooka would endure. That one determined mind, armed with nothing but necessity and imagination, could change the face of war forever. Autumn of 1945 brought quiet to the proving grounds of Aberdeen. The endless thunder of artillery and the hiss of rocket tests faded into the cold wind sweeping across the Chesapeake. For the first time in years, Lieutenant Edward Uhl could walk the length of the test range without hearing explosions in the distance. The war was over. The tanks were silent. The world he had helped arm was now trying to learn peace again. He was 27 years old, a farm boy from upstate New York who had built a weapon that reshaped modern warfare. Yet Uhl did not see himself as an inventor or a hero. When reporters came asking for interviews, he avoided them. "It wasn't me," he would say. "It was just an idea that worked." But the army disagreed. His name was attached to patent filings, to engineering reports, and to post-war studies that now filled shelves in the Ordnance archives. The world would remember him as the man who gave soldiers a way to fight tanks with their own hands. The official figures, compiled after VE Day, told a story more astonishing than any battlefield tale. Over 500,000 rocket launchers had been produced. More than 15 million rockets had been fired in combat. German and Japanese engineers had both built copies, and by 1946, even Soviet designers were developing their own versions, rudimentary prototypes that would one day evolve into the RPG family. The farm kid's homemade fix had set the pattern for every shoulder-fired anti-tank weapon that would follow. Still, in those first months of peace, Uhl could not escape the weight of what his creation had done. He spent long evenings alone in the Ordnance Library, reading through after-action reports. Some were filled with triumph, accounts of small American units halting entire tank columns, of trapped soldiers breaking out of encirclement by destroying enemy armor with their last rockets. Others were darker stories of misfires, of soldiers burned by backblast, of bazooka men killed when their positions were revealed by the flash of the rocket. Each report carried his invention's fingerprints. One evening, as he studied a thick folder of field evaluations, Dr. Clarence Hickman entered the room quietly. The older engineer had aged 10 years since they had first worked together. His hair was white now, his posture bent, but his eyes were still sharp. He placed a cup of coffee beside Uhl's papers and said, "You've been reading the ghosts again." Uhl nodded. "I just wanted to know what it all added up to." Hickman smiled faintly. "It added up to victory. And maybe to something more. You gave every soldier a chance. That matters. But it also gave them something terrible. Uhl said softly. Power in one hand. Too much power, maybe. The older man studied him for a moment. Every invention is a question we can't unask. You asked the right one. In the years that followed, the bazooka became more than a weapon. It became a symbol of ingenuity born under pressure. Military academies studied its design as a lesson in rapid development. Engineers from Britain, France, and the Soviet Union visited Aberdeen to inspect surviving prototypes. Each one wanted to understand how a weapon so crude, so simple, could have changed the course of battles that entire nations had planned for years. Uhl returned briefly to civilian life, working for General Electric on post-war rocketry projects. Yet the past followed him. The same principles that made the bazooka possible, the marriage of shaped charge chemistry and rocket propulsion, were now being applied to a new generation of weapons, guided missiles. The peaceful boy who had once tinkered with farm equipment now found himself sketching blueprints that might carry war into the skies. He often thought back to the day it had all begun, the cold January morning in 1942, when he and Hickman had first fired that improvised rocket through a plate of steel. He remembered the smell of burnt paint, the ringing echo, the stunned silence afterward. In that instant, the world had shifted. The distance between a soldier and a tank had collapsed, and the balance of power had changed forever. In 1946, the Army Ordnance Department invited Uhl to attend a ceremony honoring key wartime engineers. Generals spoke of strategy and production, of logistics and courage. When Uhl's name was called, he walked onto the stage to polite applause. The citation read, "For outstanding ingenuity in the development of the infantry anti-tank rocket launcher, a decisive contribution to the defeat of enemy armored forces." He accepted the medal, but said little. In his brief remarks, he thanked the ordnance teams, the factory workers, and the men who carried the weapon when it mattered. Then he stepped away from the microphone. It was the last public speech he ever gave. Years later, when he visited the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum, he found a familiar object displayed behind glass, one of the original Mohn launchers, paint-chipped, wiring frayed, a relic of another age. The placard beneath it read simply, "Rocket Launcher, Mohn, Bazooka, developed at Aberdeen Proving Ground, 1942. Uhl stood quietly for a long time, reading the small inscription. A group of schoolchildren walked past, laughing, their teacher explaining how American ingenuity had turned the tide of war. The lieutenant felt both pride and melancholy. The world had moved on, jet engines, rockets, atomic power, but the old stovepipe still stood as a reminder of what necessity could create. He smiled faintly and whispered, "That'll do, old friend." The bazooka had started as a desperate improvisation, a farm fix in a time of fear, but it became proof of a truth older than any war, that courage and creativity, when joined by purpose, can alter the fate of nations. And so, in the quiet halls of a museum and in the rusting hulks of tanks scattered across Europe, the legacy of Edward Uhl's invention endures a reminder that even in humanity's darkest hour, a single idea, born in the hands of a determined man, can change the world forever. By the early years of the Cold War, the world had divided into uneasy halves, each armed with lessons forged in the fires of the last war. Among those lessons, one stood above the rest. No machine, no matter how thick its armor or how powerful its engine, could stand unchallenged against the will and ingenuity of a single soldier. That revelation, the death of the tank's absolute. Dominance was written into military doctrine, and its author was the humble bazooka. In 1947, American ordnance engineers began work on new versions of Uhl's weapon, lighter and deadlier. The M22 Super Bazooka, firing a 3.5-inch rocket, could punch through 12 inches of armor. Its ignition circuit was refined, its barrel built from aluminum instead of steel, and its battery replaced with a magneto-powered trigger. The farm kid's stovepipe had become a precision instrument. Lieutenant Uhl, now a civilian working at General Electric, watched this evolution with quiet fascination. "They've made it better," he said once to Hickman. but it's still the same soul. The old scientist nodded. It'll always be your weapon, Ed. They just keep painting it in new colors. When the Korean War broke out in June of 1950, the bazooka went back to war. Young American soldiers, many born after Uhl had first tested his prototype, carried the new model against North Korean 34 tanks built in Soviet factories. The irony was sharp. Weapons descended from Uhl's design were now fighting tanks descended from German and Russian engineering that had once terrified Europe. Reports from the front told the same story that had unfolded in North Africa years before. Infantrymen, outnumbered and outgunned, halted tank columns with shoulder-fired rockets. Sergeant Charles Handy of the 24th Infantry Division wrote home, "It's like déjà vu from Dad's war. Same stovepipe, same roar, same miracle." For Uhl, the news carried a mix of pride and sorrow. His creation, meant to win one desperate war, had found permanence in another. Each generation of soldiers seemed destined to inherit his invention, each learning the same grim arithmetic of range, velocity, and survival. The bazooka also reshaped global warfare beyond the American sphere. The captured weapons of 1944 had been studied in Berlin, Moscow, and Tokyo, and after the war those blueprints spread like seeds. Soviet engineers produced the RPG-2, an even simpler descendant that could be built in any machine shop. It would one day arm rebels, revolutionaries, and insurgents from Asia to Africa. The farm boy's idea had escaped its birthplace and become the universal language of the powerless against the powerful. By the mid-1950s, newsreels showed freedom fighters in Hungary and guerrillas in Indochina carrying tubular launchers that owed their existence to a Maryland prototype built from scrap wire. To governments and generals, it was a weapon. To those who carried it, it was a symbol, a reminder that one man could still strike back against steel and tyranny. When Uhl saw those images, he turned off the television. "That's not what I built it for," he said quietly. Hickman, by then retired and ill, replied only, "You built it so men wouldn't have to run. That doesn't change." Time moved forward, as it always does. The bazooka faded from American service, replaced by the recoilless rifle and later the guided missile. But its shadow remained on every battlefield where infantry faced armor. From the jungles of Vietnam to the deserts of the Middle East, the principle was the same. A single soldier with a rocket could stop a column of tanks. The idea that began in a drafty shed at Aberdeen had rewritten the geometry of war. In 1962, Uhl was invited to speak at the U.S.-Japanese Aviation History Symposium in Honolulu. When his name was announced, the audience rose in applause. Among the guests was an elderly Japanese officer, once a pilot during the war. After the session, he approached Uhl, bowed deeply, and said in halting English, "Your weapon, it changed everything. We all feared it." Uhl shook his hand. "So did we," he replied. In his later years, he often returned to his father's farm in upstate New York. The fields were quiet now, the soil rich and forgiving. Sometimes he would stand by the old barn and look at the rusted tools that had taught him to improvise, to mend what was broken, to make do with what was at hand. It was there, among ploughs and wire and scrap metal, that the habit of fixing things had been born, and from that habit had come the weapon that changed the world. Historians would later call it the democratization of destruction. With the bazooka, the balance of power had shifted forever from machines to men. No empire could again rely on armor alone. No army could march unopposed by courage and cleverness. When Uhl passed away in 1983, his obituary was brief. It mentioned his rank, his service, and a single line: inventor of the bazooka, the first practical infantry anti-tank rocket launcher. There were no medals on his coffin, no parades, only the echo of a lifetime spent turning necessity into invention. Today, in the museums of Washington, London, and Berlin, the weapon sits silent behind glass. Its paint is chipped, its wires corroded, but its legacy endures. Beside one display at the National World War II Museum, a plaque reads, From a farm boy's hand came the weapon that gave the infantryman back his courage. That courage born of desperation, refined by ingenuity, and carried through generations remains Edward Uhl's true invention. The bazooka was merely its vessel, and long after its rockets fell silent, the idea it embodied the power of one determined mind to balance the odds continues to shape the world it once saved.